Good afternoon. I'm on the East Coast of the U.S., so it's been afternoon here for a while, but I think it's probably afternoon where everybody is by now, at least in the North American region. My name is Jeff Warrender. I'm a game designer from upstate New York, and I have a small company called Bell Tower Games. We're releasing a game shortly called The Acts of the Evangelists, a game about composing the Christian Gospels. So more about that at our website, belltowergames.com. But I am delighted to be given the opportunity to present today. I want to thank the Christian Game Developers Conference for having me. And I'm going to talk to you today about some ideas from a book I've written, which is called You Said This Would Be Fun. And the whole point of this book is to improve our game design craft so that we don't hear our playtesters saying that to us as often as we have heard it in the past, doubtless. So the You Said This Would Be Fun concept is about player-centered game design. So most of what I'm going to talk about today is tabletop game design, but I hope some of this content will be applicable to other styles of game as well. And in tabletop game design, at the moment, in the Euro world especially, you get these games where there's a ton of icons, there's a zillion different kinds of components, and you as the player are supposed to marvel at the clockwork. Oh, look at the sophistication of this thing. But I think player-centered design is really more about giving the player a great experience. And to me, that entails three elements: engagement, motivation, and challenge. And I'm going to talk about what each of those means to me. But before we get to that point, I'd like to motivate this with a different rule of three. There's a bunch of rule of threes in this talk, buckle up, that comes from a blog post I wrote a number of years ago that I think undergirds this You Said This Would Be Fun conceptual framework. When I first started thinking about starting a company, it's taken me a number of years to get to this point. I experienced a lot of pushback. Like, why would you do this? Why would you create a company to make Christian games? Why does the world need Christian games? Why can't Christians just play any old game? And I was really taken aback by that because that to me was not the point of this whole thing. It wasn't to make Jesus approved games for good Christian boys and girls. That was not the thought at all. Rather, the point was that this is a vital medium that has a lot of overlap with the Christian faith and with, as a form of artistic expression for believers. And so this was the blog post I wrote to sort of justify that point of view. And I came up with three concepts, three principles. The first is that games tell stories. Now, I think as humans, we know how much we're drawn to stories. It's built into our DNA. Our stories resonate with us. We attach ourselves to them. We want to know what's going to happen next. And games are a great way of delivering this, especially so for role-playing games and digital games, but even a tabletop, board game is going to have a narrative arc. There's going to be excitement, tension, suspense, all the qualities that make for a fun story. As Christians, we're also very invested in stories. And I don't even just mean, oh, Jesus taught in parables. I'm talking about the central story is Christ died, was buried, was seen alive after his death by his female followers and then by his disciples. That is a story. That is the story. That is the story on which Christianity is based. And without that story, there's no Christianity. Without that story being true, there's no point to Christianity. So if stories are so important to our faith and stories are something games can deliver, there's a natural congruence there. The second principle is that games permit social interaction. Now, social interaction comes very naturally to extroverts, to more introverted people like me. It's fine. Sometimes it takes some of your energy, whatever. Maybe we enjoy it, maybe we don't. But it can be kind of awkward to just all get together and let's just chit chat about whatever all. But playing a game is a form of substantive and structured social interaction. So that can really answer the question of, well, now what are we going to do? Social interaction is also a crucial part of the Christian faith because of the Great Commission. And I'm not talking here about bothering the poor woman next to you on the airplane or anything like that. What I'm talking about more is that the Great Commission tells us we are supposed to be outward looking. We are a community of faith, and we want other people to feel welcome to join in our community, to become a part of our faith and our faith tradition. So social interaction is a crucial part of the Christian faith. The third concept was critical thinking. Games promote critical thinking. There's no question about that. Now, let me be careful here, because I'm going to sound like I'm being snooty and just talking about, strategy games and things like that. There are games that are silly, games where you're just chucking dice, games that are party games. All of those are perfectly valid, perfectly fun. These are great games to play. I'm not, casting any aspersions on any of that kind of game. But even for some of those games that rely on decisions require critical thinking. You have to assess, what are my capabilities? What are my assets? It's like the scene in Princess Bride where, well, we've got your steel, his strength, and my brains, and those are our assets. What's our plan? That's what you have to do in gaming. That's what we have to do in life, especially in the present cultural moment where information is flying around fast and furious. What are we going to do about it? Well, in the Christian faith, we also have to think critically. And, I'm not going to pull out the Noble Bereans quote on you. I guess I sort of just did. But what I'm talking about more is, our foundational text emerged from a culture removed from us by 2,000 years, and in a language that none of us speak. And, oh, by the way, in a language that our founder did not speak. So it's a translation of a translation. So any thought that we have of, oh, the Bible says it, that settles it, that is so simplistic. We have to engage our critical thinking faculties to be able to think carefully about what this text is saying to us and how to apply it to the present moment, to our life situation, all that kind of thing, and to games. So that gets us to this, you said this would be fun concept. So we said we want to engage, motivate, and challenge our players. Look at how these two rules of three interlock with one another. Engagement is what draws players in. Stories draw people in. They make us want to be part of that story. So a game that presents an exciting story and an exciting world to the player is going to cause that engagement to happen. Motivation, that's what makes us want to play the game well, that makes us want to contend for the victory. That is a form of social interaction. It's one of the original, or not the original, but one of the oldest forms of human interaction is the contest. Who can throw this rock the furthest, or whatever silly thing. We love to compete. We love to contend it within the confines of the magic circle, where it's all just for fun and all in good sportsmanship. And so motivation and social interaction are closely interconnected. And then third, we want to challenge the players, and challenging them by giving them agonizing decisions that makes them use their critical thinking capabilities is a great way to do that. So we have story, interaction, and critical thinking, and we have engagement, motivation, and challenge, and these two fit together really well. So we've convinced ourselves that there's a point to the remaining 20 minutes of this talk, and I'm mindful of the fact that the average person can listen to something for about 17 minutes. So really, we've got about 9 minutes to go for most of you out there. So for the rest of you, hang in there for the other 11 minutes after that, or whatever, too. So what I'm going to do now is go through a little vignette from each of these three parts of the book. See, engagement, motivation, challenge, these are each a multi-chapter part in this book. And I'm just going to give you a snapshot. Of course, check out the book on Amazon or Drive-Thru-RPG if you're interested to hear more about it. Engagement comes from the story, what draws the player in. But it's not just because stories are exciting and stories are fun. It's also because the benefit that prior knowledge has in helping us to learn a new skill. And learning how to play a game is a form of learning a skill. Prior knowledge gives us a vocabulary of nouns and verbs that we can use to describe what we're doing when we're playing the game. So I'm going to hop on this train and ride it to Tuscaloosa. That makes intuitive sense to me in a way that, I'm going to move my pawn from here to there. I mean, that also makes sense, but it sort of explains the reason within the game's story of why I'm doing that. And that in turn helps me to internalize the game's rules. Like, oh, well, I can only go to Tuscaloosa, but I can't also go to, you know, Bemidji after that because it's in a totally different place, blah, 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 whatever. So I think, the prior knowledge connection that our stories give us helps. The way we bring that out most effectively is when we have good answers to three questions. Who am I in the game's world? What would I consider to be a success? And what would I consider to be a struggle? So, that I would have to face in pursuit of that goal. I think the more intuitive the answers to these questions are, the more the game is going to resonate, the more the game is going to engage us. Now, I think one of the challenges this presents for us as Christians is when we want to build a game around one of the stories of our faith, and we assume, oh, that's probably very familiar. This story of Gideon's very familiar. This, maybe not. I mean, I think biblical literacy is not super duper high. Even people who've been raised in the church may not, know all of the stories, even ones you'd think might be familiar. So I think we have to, in those cases, look for our prior knowledge in other aspects of the story sometimes. And I'll give an example of this from a game that I worked on, which is called Talents, and it's about the parable of the talents. You probably know what that is, but if you don't, it doesn't matter because a lot of people would play this game and have no idea what that parable was. So how do we connect them to the game? Well, in this game, we're in a marketplace and we're trying to buy and sell and realize the biggest gain. Everyone starts with different money to start with. That's sort of the hook to the parable. But the way we do that is through bidding. It's an auction game where the currency we're bidding is time. And this represents the idea of haggling. So I'm going to go to the marketplace and I'm going to try and get the best price on these goats or whatever, this oil, but it's going to take me some time to do that. And the more time I spend haggling, the better price I'm going to get, but the less time I have available to do other things. That is pretty intuitive. That's pretty, not that everyone goes to the marketplace and haggles, but everyone at least gets the idea of, what haggling entails. And so spending time to get a good price, okay, that's something I can latch on to and use as prior knowledge to propel me forward into the game's mechanics. So I think that's just one example. There are other ways of doing this, but I think it's a good idea to try and find aspects of the story that connect to things that the person does probably have some prior knowledge of. And I'll talk also about my game Evangelist just for a little bit. We're traveling around the Mediterranean world, interviewing eyewitnesses and writing stories into the pages of our gospel. So even if you don't know much about the gospels, the idea of it's a biography, I'm interviewing witnesses, which are represented by wooden discs. I'm getting stories and I'm putting them on the pages of my book. Those things at least make sense because people have read books before and read biographies and know about, interviewing witnesses and that kind of stuff. So it builds off of knowledge that people do have. Okay, great. So that's one way that we can engage players is by giving them sensible answers to the questions of who they are and what they would consider to be a reasonable goal to be in pursuit of. This is also, incidentally, an opportunity for creativity. If you can come up with better answers than, like, oh, you're the king and you want a lot of lands. I mean, okay. Yeah, the king always wants more land. Okay, great. Can we come up with someone more interesting than the king to be? Can we come up with something more interesting for the king to want than lots of lands? If we can come up with good answers, maybe we can come up with better games too, perhaps. So the second point I want to talk about is motivation. How do we motivate players through the form of the contest? What is it that is the goal that we set before them? This can be anything. It can be a race. It can be victory points. It can be whatever. The real way that the goal is going to create motivation is if it creates an interesting contest against their opponents. And the key concept to that, to me, is friction. Now, friction is a word that conveys a sense of resistance to movement. So, on a very low friction surface like ice, I can slide very easily. On a high friction surface like a carpet, there's a lot of resistance to how I move across that. Well, it's the same way with games. The opponents create friction to my movement towards victory. They impede my progress towards victory. Now, friction doesn't always have to even be a negative thing. In a trading game, we're making deals that are of mutual benefit. So we're not necessarily trying to block one another, but nevertheless, there is still friction in the sense that I don't want to, give you too great of a deal, or I want to get a fair price for what I'm offering and all that kind of thing. So it's just the form that interaction takes. Friction, to me, is akin to a test of mettle, mettle, not metal, metal. And it's kind of who wants it more. I've raised the bid to 12. Are you going to go to 13, or are you going to back down? Or maybe you think 12 is too much and I've overdone it. So I think it's sort of this grappling and this contesting things that leads to these little moments of excitement that make the game jump along. And at the end of the game, when we reveal who is the winner, these little moments of friction will reveal themselves to have been important, such that the end of the game is the culmination of those moments. So we had these little moments that excited us, that we had to contend with our opponents. And then in the end, oh yeah, you got the best of all those deals. Of course, you will go on to be the winner. That makes sense. So I think here, again, there's a challenge we have to grapple with as Christians, which is, are all sources of friction created equal? For example, I have a game I worked on called Disciples, which is about the disciples. I'm not great at naming things, incidentally, but this particular game, it wouldn't have made sense for us to be throwing body blocks at one another, or like, oh, I want to be Jesus' favorite or something like that. I mean, I guess there's kind of textual precedent for that, but, look, we want to, we want to have things that sort of seem congruent with the story and build on people's prior knowledge. So what I came up with for that one was the scoring system is built around doing good deeds that are based on Jesus' teachings. Someone is in need, you're going to help them. So if someone else is in the same town as you, then in addition to your score for doing that good deed, you get another point and they get a point as well. So we've sort of collaborated with one another. It creates a positive interaction that makes me want to go somewhere where I think someone else is going to try and do something, so I can help them out and sort of get something out of it. But also it makes me want to maybe go where other people are so that I can get some extra help and they get something out of it, but I get even more out of it as well. So that's the kind of positive friction interaction that we can create. Another example is from my game Evangelists, which has a follow mechanic. So on your turn, you can do a couple of different kinds of actions. And one of the things another player can do is give you a follow token to copy your action. And you use this mostly if it's like, oh, I have a story here I'm going to put in my gospel. It's the parable of the talents or whatever. Oh, I'm going to follow you. And I'm also going to put that story in my gospel. And now you have this follow token that you can use to follow someone else's action. So it's a positive interaction. It's sort of thematic. It emulates the borrowing that we know happens in the composition of the gospels, and it's fun. It keeps you engaged in other players' turns, so that can be a fun thing. So friction can come in a lot of different forms. We have to pick sources of friction that match well with the story we're trying to tell in our game. Okay, the third point was challenge. How do we challenge our players? We've delighted them with our story. We've motivated them to want to pursue the victory. But what makes it hard for them to get there? Because it's, it's like I play the I win card. That, no one wants to play a game like that. You want to feel like you challenged yourself in some way. And the way that I think we can best do that is with agonizing decisions. And again, lots of different kinds of games, flicking games, dice rolling games, trivia games, all perfectly fine. Not a single thing wrong with any of that style of game. But I think, to me, what I like is when a game gives me a decision that I have to really grapple with. And there's a difference between a decision and a guess. If I say, pick a hand and I'll give you the thing that's in that hand, that's not a decision. A decision has some motivation behind it, some information. So on the one hand, I have this delicious brownie. On the other hand, I have this very healthy salad. And I can sort of weigh the pros and cons of each of those options. And ideally, they should both have some really pros and some real cons, like, so I really feel like, which one do I want to take? I think part of what can make a agonizing decision really come to life is the tension that comes from risk. And I don't necessarily mean risk in the sense of randomness, although that's a part of it. But risk fundamentally is uncertainty about the future. I don't know for sure what's going to happen. And that's what makes my decision so agonizing. If I knew that this stock was going to go up 200% and this only 100%, that's not an agonizing decision. That's an easy decision. The uncertainty is what makes that exciting. And I think the idea of risk and uncertainty putting you in tension, can really bring about this kind of agony in the player. So that is a good place to look. But again, this presents challenges for us in trying to make explicitly Christian games, particularly in the sense of the interaction with the divine, which is an element of many of these stories, and the hand of providence and all that sort of thing. We want to have a degree of uncertainty about the timing and nature of divine intervention, because that makes sense in the story in most cases. So on the one hand, it wouldn't really make sense to have something that's like, I pay 3 prayer points and a miracle happens. I mean, is that how we think miracles work? But then on the other hand, it's like, I roll the die, a miracle. Hey, I got a miracle. Is that how we think miracles work? We want to be careful about what we encode into the mechanics of our game, what it's saying in the way that we incorporate some of these ideas. And so I think this has to be done carefully. And I'll give another example of a game of mine called Moses and Pharaoh. Again, fairly obvious title. You can guess what it might be about. But in this game, Pharaoh has a pride track signifying his defiance, his opposition to Moses and to the God of Israel. And so here we have, on the one hand, if Pharaoh is too generous, that makes Moses' life pretty easy, and Moses appreciates that. But if Pharaoh is very stingy, if he's very prideful, that makes him susceptible to a plague. It's easier for Moses to drop a plague on Pharaoh the more prideful Pharaoh is. But at that point, Moses draws a plague card, and that says what happens. And so sometimes it's a direct, hit right between the eyes, and sometimes it's a glancing blow, and Pharaoh just says, that's all you've got? My magicians can do that. I don't care about that. And that really fits with the story too. But I think what it does in game terms is it says the plagues are a reflection of the condition of Pharaoh's heart, but they're also not completely within Moses' direct ability to control them. He can't really say, darkness, because that's not what happens in the story. So I think that's a good thing to worry about in the risk domain, is how can I bring about elements of uncertainty that allow the full range of things that can happen in these stories, but that is also sensitive and respectful to how they happen, and that isn't heretical or blasphemous or anything like that, because maybe we should be careful about that. So that's the third element of games, is challenge. So we have a couple of minutes left, and I thought in these remaining couple of minutes, I might come back around to the point I brought up in the very beginning, which was this idea of why make Christian games in the first place, or why as a Christian make games in the first place. I think we probably all have our own answer for that. So this is all just personal. Disregard all of this if it's not helpful to you. But I think for me, it's never about an expectation that this is going to be some kind of Damascus Road experience, that someone's going to play the game and, I see the light. I'm not saying that can't happen. I'm saying to me, it feels far-fetched, or at least it feels unlikely enough that I think there are more efficient ways of spending my time and money than that, if that was truly the effect that I was hoping to produce. I think there's a different motivation, at least for me, and it's that we're in a cultural moment where there's a lot of skepticism, a lot of distrust, a lot of contempt for the Christian faith. And I'm not even saying it's not all of it's deserved, or that it's all deserved, or whatever. Whatever the reason is, that's the reality of the world that we're in. At the same time, as we talked about earlier, there's also really a lack of understanding about our faith and we ourselves. And, people don't know even the most basic stuff about the Bible, about Jesus, about Moses, about, just the most famous characters in the Bible. People don't know anything. So we have this weird situation where people know that they don't really like us that much or don't like our faith that much, but they don't really know why. So what can we do about that? And I think games can provide a helpful contribution to that conversation. In this sense, most of the playtesters of my game, Acts of the Evangelists, belltowergames.com, were non-believers. They're all my friends, and many of them are not Christian believers. And every single one, after playing the game, said, "Wow, that was really pleasant. That was really fun. I had a really good time. That was not what I expected. I had a really good time playing that." We've created positive associations for them with some time spent thinking about, um, you know, Christian ideas. That in and of itself is beneficial. It helps make the conversation between us more constructive, more respectful. And I think in addition, they've learned a couple of things that they didn't know prior to playing the game. They know that the first century church was spread all around the Roman Empire. They know that the gospel writers interviewed eyewitnesses. They know that the gospel writers arranged their material in ways that created literary devices. And they know all of those things because they've done those things in the act of playing the game. And so they've learned it and then sort of in a pretend way experienced it. And I think that's a way to help that knowledge stick. But either way, it's knowledge they probably didn't have previously. So we've given them an opportunity to have a positive experience, and an experience that wasn't necessarily, intended to beat them over the head with the principles of faith or the, you know, theory of the atonement or anything like that. It was just, here's some things that you probably didn't know that now you know about the early Jesus movement. And, is that beneficial to your life? I mean, who knows, but tuck it away. And at least now, the next time you have a conversation with a believer or with me or with whoever else, we have some basis for things to talk about. We have, something in common now that we now know, that we now share. And I think that gets to the social interaction piece of how we can create positive relationships with people, is by giving them positive experiences with Christianity and using those as the foundation for what we hope will be constructive and friendly relationships with people. So, in summary, games tell stories, games promote interaction, games promote critical thinking. We can do this in a player-centered way when we engage, motivate, and challenge our players. And we hope that this will be beneficial to them. Most of all, that they're just going to have a good time. I mean, these are games we're talking about. Ultimately, they're supposed to be fun. We want players to have fun and to say that they had fun afterwards and not chastise us for leading them down the primrose path of something that wasn't actually all that fun after all. So I hope that this talk has been fun. I hope you've enjoyed this and found some applicability to some of these ideas for some of your own game design projects, or maybe motivated to try and take on a game design project if you haven't worked on one previously. So either way, I want to thank the Matt and the CGDC once again for this opportunity to present. And we have a few minutes, so I'd be very happy to take any questions or commentary, feedback. It doesn't have to be just Q&A. You can, air points of agreement or disagreement. We can talk about whatever. So, but thank you all very, very much indeed. I appreciate the opportunity. And yeah, thanks. Okay, I think everyone can read this, so I don't have to read the question. Am I right in assuming that? So, uh, so fictionalizing or adding elements that are not historic. Um, this is a great question. I did not plant this question, I promise you. It's a really good question. Okay. The there is artistic license in my game, The Acts of the Evangelist. You travel around the Roman world. There are 9 cities, each of which has a Jesus community, each of which has one eyewitness in that community. That is probably not exactly how things worked historically. Probably a lot of the witnesses were located in the Jerusalem church. So probably, especially Luke, who probably emphasized sources from that church, probably did not have terribly far to go at all in his composition of his text. There are some things that are taken as poetic license, artistic license to make it into a game. I think people should expect that to be the case in a game, unless it's trying really hard to be historical, like war games tend to do. To my mind, this is highly congruent with the Gospels themselves, which themselves take some artistic license with how things are arranged. And this is something that comes through in my game. As an example, in Gospel A, you have event 1 and event 2 in this order. In Gospel B, they're in a different order. Why is that? Well, it's because chronology was not a driving concern for the Gospel writers to the same degree that other concerns like thematic resonance and things were. In addition to that, Jesus did not speak Greek, and all of the Gospels are written in Greek. So we have translations or transliterations of Aramaic speeches that he gave from people's memory. It's not like he had a stenographer transcribing everything. So, you get divergence between the gospel writers on the same speech, but you can tell that the core content of each speech is preserved. Just the exact wording is, maybe varies from text to text. That's all very reasonable. But this is the kind of thing that if you were, if you've ever spent way too much time debating internet atheists about, like I did many years ago, it's like this, people latch on to stuff like this, but it's like, no. This is why critical thinking is so important, because if we understand the Gospels in their historical and textual context, we realize that a lot of these things aren't necessarily bad, that a little bit of, artistic license is beneficial because that's the kind of text they're trying to write. They're not necessarily trying to write what we would think of as a modern, biography. And so I think this game, I don't feel too bad about taking some artistic license with, with the game. I think there is, this game itself is definitely based on scholarly work, which books I do not have, but, Jesus and the Eyewitnesses, what are the Gospels, the earliest Christian artifacts, so it's motivated by real substantive scholarship. But yes, it is a game, just, like watching a movie. It's a historical movie. It's like inspired by actual events, but there are liberties for sure. But you're right. You have to be judicious in how you choose those liberties. So choose wisely, as someone famous once said. Too Christian. Oh boy. Yes. Yeah. That's right. I think people have this idea that Christian game, oh, it's a Jesus game, it must be all about um Bible trivia or something, because that's what all Christian games are, aren't they? I don't know where people got this idea. I don't know where we got the idea that the biblical texts are not an appropriate source for game mechanics and that sort of thing. But to me, I think what a lot of people, I've gotten a really, really positive reception to this game, to people I've told about it. And I think what people have responded to is, look, we can't argue with what you're putting out here, because it's historical, or quasi historical. It's aspiring to be at least somewhat historically informed, as opposed to being evangelical or didactic or something like that. You're not trying to preach to us about your faith. You're just using your faith as a motivation to come up with some fun game mechanics, and you're trying to help us have a good time. So I think that has been very helpful to me. I think, to me, the thing that I don't want to give advice, because I think people should work on what they're inspired and motivated to work on. But I know for me, I wouldn't myself make a game with, like, that was just sort of a simulation of faith. Like, oh, we've got to, accumulate this many prayer points, and we've got to accumulate this many faith, tokens and that kind of thing. I think that to me is a little bit on the nose, and I think that can be off-putting. But I think there are exceptions to that too. I think there are games that have done things kind of like that people have liked, who non-Christians have liked. So I think it's all just in how you handle it. But I think, to me, you said this would be fun idea is that your game scoring system is the most important thing. That is the contract you're making between designer and player. And the contract is, if you pursue this scoring system to the best of your ability, you will have fun. So I think ultimately that's where the rubber meets the road. In my game, you're trying to write a good gospel as defined by the victory points in this game. But ultimately, that's your goal as a player. You're trying to write a good gospel. Okay, I can get into that. I'm trying to write a good book. Great. So I think giving players something that motivates them in the form of a goal is the truest way to be respectful of them and to, hopefully motivate them. Even if there's a little barrier of resistance to, Jesus game. I don't know about that. I hope. We'll see. It isn't for sale yet, so we'll see how it actually does. Theological disagreements. Geez. Okay, so no more hard questions, please, everybody. Like, let's have easy questions. Like, how do I buy this game? Go to belltowergames.com and sign up for our mailing list. That's a great question. Thank you for whoever asked it. Theological disagreements. This is an interesting one. For the most part, my playtesting group has a couple of fellow Christians in it, but not many. My family is great, but they are not great game enthusiasts. So they've done a little testing, but not a ton. So I've kind of had just free reign to do whatever I wanted to in this. I think in all honesty to the question, I don't think my game, this particular game, is making a theological point, but I think it is making a historical point. And I think there are people who will disagree with its historical message, and maybe even some people listening in. And I certainly don't mean any offense to anybody, but I think it's very possible people will say, wait a minute. You have these people going around and interviewing people and writing the Gospels. That's not how they came about. They're divinely inspired texts. To me, they're both. And the reason we can say that these texts came about through some composition process is because that's what the textual evidence says, according to scholars who are not, the liberal scholars or critical scholars or whatever. Like, evangelical scholars make these kind of arguments. You can disagree with them, but I think that's where our disagreement would have to happen. Is I would say, well, based on what this scholarly work says, here's how this evidence supports this idea. And you could say, well, I don't agree with that. And then we could have that conversation. So I think that, to me, is the way I've tried to deflect any kind of, preemptively, to deflect any kind of criticism along those lines is, either, look, I'm basing this on my best understanding of the scholarship I've read, which is incomplete because I'm not a scholar. I've read some books. Here's what I came away from those books with. The alternative is to say, this game about Noah's Ark, this game about Moses and Pharaoh, it's just pretend. It's not supposed to be making a theological point. Like, it's just supposed, it's like a theme park ride kind of game, which I think is another perfectly valid thing to do. Like, my Moses and Pharaoh game is probably, if I'm being honest, more based on the 10 Commandments than on Exodus. But that's okay. So I think either of those two things seem like an acceptable response to me. But yeah, your mileage will vary depending on what you're trying to do with your game and who on your team, what the diversity of perspectives you have. But I think trying to give everybody on the same, on the same sheet of music is certainly important, beneficial for sure. Great question. Gameplay mechanics saying things that are wrong. Can you talk about this? good examples of good gameplay mechanics. Yeah, I mean, I think to me, mechanics, resonate to the extent that they match up with what's happening. And so one of the examples I give in my book is like for example, this game Talents that I told you about, where we're sort of haggling in the form of bidding. Okay, that makes sense. If instead we had a mechanic where it's like, okay, you go to the market and you roll a die and that tells you how much this thing is selling for. It's like, okay. And then you keep rolling and you're pressing your luck. It's like, that doesn't really make any sense to me in any kind of intuitive way. So you've sort of the concern I have about those kind of things is it takes you out of the moment and just reminds you that you're playing a game. You're just manipulating some components because the game says that you have to. To me, the game that is the best merit, well, there are so many good examples, but I think to me, one game that I think works very well is a game that most people would think is very abstract, but it's Lost Cities. So this is a Reiner Nietzsche game where we have cards that represent expeditions, and we have a hand of cards, and we have to play them in increasing order. And I think this captures the idea of how of two things. First, that expeditions, archaeological expeditions, are always somewhat speculative ventures. You don't know for sure what you're going to find. Your hand of cards represents things that, some background information you have, but nothing is ever complete. Nothing's ever a sure thing. You don't know for sure until you start digging. And it also reflects the idea that sometimes you have to know when to get out, when you have to cut your losses, when it's not going to happen. Now it does this in an abstract way, but to me, it's just cards with numbers on them. That could be about anything. I suppose it could. My friend made a game called Emu Ranchers, which uses the same basic mechanics, but you're raising emus. So okay, fair enough. But to me, it also works for that, but it really works for the idea of some of the concepts that come through in archaeological expeditions is, do I keep going after this one? Do I keep waiting? Or do I just close this one off and direct my attention elsewhere in the limited time I have available? So I think there are lots of other great examples, great games that in simple ways can bring about some of these ideas, but those are just a couple that I like. Okay. Well, great. Those were some great questions. Thank you all very, very much. I was just kidding about the hard questions. They were really great. So I want to thank you all once again for letting me talk about this topic. Once again, the game is The Acts of the Evangelist. It's probably coming out in the next month or so. So check the website. The website is a work in progress, but the mailing list works. So that's where real information will come from. But anyway, I hope this is helpful. Please contact me if you wish. I'm at Bell Tower Games at Twitter, also Instagram, Jeff at belltowergames.com by email. I'd love to hear what you're working on and, play test some of your stuff, read your rules, whatever. It would be great to interact with some of you. That would be a lot of fun. I'd really welcome that opportunity. So please reach out, and I'm looking forward to the rest of the talks this afternoon. But thank you all very, very much, and have a great rest of your day. Bye-bye.